Thank you very much, Fabio, and thank you for a lovely paper, Vimal, and thank you all for coming. So I'm going to, Fabio has introduced Vimal with his kind of the highlights briefly, but I just want to mention another couple of things. We all know him from here, but he has also been, he won the Mandela Scholarship to attend University of Michigan, where he got a PhD in 2007. He's done a huge amount of work, research and teaching at UCT, Wits and Yale and Michigan as well, mainly on labor economics, econometrics and game theory. So I had to ask him what game theory was, but we're going to leave it right there for now because we have other things to talk about. More recently, he won the Francis Wilson Memorial Prize, which was a great moment in, I think, the collective celebrations of SALDRU, that somebody from inside, and I don't think it was an inside job, won it for the work that he's done on this paper that he's going to present today. What he doesn't mention in his CV, because Vimal was always such a whiz at numbers, when I was Ombud, I had a very complicated case where the complainant was Derek Wakeford. For those who don't know, he worked in Bosasa and was an advisor to the Watson family. And it was to do with the Lindela Repatriation Center that the Watson family, Bosasa, was running on behalf of Home Affairs. And the gist of the story was that they were making more money because of the Zimbabwean exemption. The number of detainees had gone down. And it was a lot to do with averages and costs, and there were loads of numbers. And I said, Vimal, please come and help me. And we got quite deep into this adjudication, because it was an adjudication. And one of the quotes from an anonymous source said that their profits had gone up because their costs had dropped by 300%. So Vimal just said to the reporter, your costs can't drop by 300%, it's impossible. And then the reporter said, yeah, but it was a metaphorical number. So he said, if all the numbers are metaphorical, the story doesn't hold up. And it was a great pity, but he was a great help in that, because I was so drowning in the numbers, I couldn't have helped. So that was his other great contribution to mine. Previous life as the Ombud. So Vimal has written this paper, and I'm not sure who here has had a chance to read it. But published in the Journal of Development Economics on understanding the effects of racial classification in South Africa. And he's looked at what has happened since 1951 with whether you were classified colored or classified white. But I want to just ask Vimal to talk about what inspired the paper, and to say again, on behalf of all of us, congratulations on winning the Francis Wilson Memorial Prize.
Thanks, Prof. Yeah, I mean, it was a big honor for us to win this prize, both for myself and Miquel, my co-author. And you know, it's Francis, so the Francis Wilson Prize.
Mary's saying, speak up a bit, a little bit.
Okay, you could also come closer. But the point is, yeah, I mean, it was just such a big deal for us to win this prize that it was great. And we think that Francis, of course, everyone here knows him and he was a legend, but it's also a paper which Miquel and I discussed beforehand. We said, this is the type of paper he would have liked, or we think he would have liked anyway. So that was a big deal. So what was your question?
No, the question was, what is the essence of the paper? What did you set out to do in trying to determine the effects of race classification?
Okay, so what we're trying to do was estimate the causal effect of race on a set of economic outcomes, right? And that's much harder than it sounds, because when we're thinking of estimating causal effects, then economists have a very particular conception of what is a cause. That's just conceptually, and then econometrically, there's a few ways in which you can establish a causal inference. And in our case, we managed to do that credibly, I think.
We're going to go into how you used the data just in a couple of minutes, and what you did, which is which seems very comprehensive, and it was very impressive. But why did you choose the topic that you did? That's my interest, because you mention, in some of your other conversations and thoughts, that race, as in and of itself, has not been a major focus of study in economics, certainly here at our university. What made you look at what the difference race classification makes to your outcome in life?
Okay, so that's a big question and a hard question. So I mean, I think if you're in a South African researcher or interested in South Africa, then to me that's the question. I don't think you can have any story about pretty much any other aspect of our society without going through race, because it was the primary type of organizing principle of our society for so long, right? So why would you be interested in studying race? I mean, it's almost the other way around. I think, why would we not? But you quickly hit up against this barrier where our methods and our burdens of proof are such that it's quite hard to establish the causal inference around race.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, there's a famous paper which you study in econometrics by Holland from the 1980s, where he goes into this set of axioms about causal inference. And one of the things that comes out is that you can't, empirically at least, identify the causal effect of an attribute. So an attribute is something that is something you can't change, you've just given it or you have it, but now it's there. And so in the Holland paper, they're quite explicit about saying, you can't ask about the causal effect of race. It's just nonsensical. And I remember we had a professor at Michigan, his name was John Dinado, and he gave us a long lecture. I have a vivid memory of this, saying, it doesn't make sense. You can't ask about the causal effect of race, because what's the thought experiment? Would you change someone's race? But at that point, you're changing the person. You can't think of the same person and change their race, but it's the same person. And so the idea is that you couldn't ask about the causal effect of race in observational studies, at least. And I was thinking, that was about 20 years ago now, but in South Africa you could, actually. So, and I mean, I've thought about it a lot since. The way that's written, and he's summarizing a set of papers from the 70s and 80s, actually. In that paper, he's synthesizing across. But at that time, they almost surely were thinking of race as a genetic marker. It's something that you're born with and it's in your chromosomes. Whereas now, I think many people would think more of race as a social construct, or a social and political construct. So that was a different era in some ways. I mean, at that time you were still in a world where scientific racism was seriously being debated. So,
but you do a very interesting thing in your paper, because you take, in South Africa, it was your race objectively determined your outcome. It wasn't a subjective thing. So you take the Population Registration Act of 1950, and you look at 3 censuses after that, and you look at what happened to particular people, and mainly, we should say, and you can maybe expand on this for people who haven't read the paper, between white and colored people, and men, white and colored men. But you take that bit of race legislation, which was crucial to apartheid. It was, I suppose, the kind of axis on which everything else was based. So just explain why you did that, and then how you used the analysis of the censuses and the data to determine the outcomes that you come to.
Okay, so we're using the censuses from the 80s and 90s because that's where we could find data, actually. It's just a pragmatic choice. But also we're looking at people who were born in the 1950s, right? Particularly those born in 1950 and 1952, and a little bit around that as well. But people born in the 50s, and now they're adults, they're in their 30s and 40s later on. So they're adults when we're looking at their economic outcomes. But the classification decision would have happened when they were young. And so the fact that we can't see what happened in 1951, except that we can see what their race is in 1980 or 1990, the key thing for us is how we can identify the effect of race from that 1950 law. But our observation space is in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, and what did you do to determine the effects on income that you is your your analysis basically comes to a conclusion that the income differential is quite substantial between whether you classified white or coloured, and just explain what that is and how it affected life outcomes.
Okay, so to begin with, I have to first explain how we would be thinking about the causal effect, right? So conceptually, I'm imagining a world where in one state of the world there's a person or a young child, and in one state of the world they get classified as colored, and in another state of the world they get classified as white. And if I had superpowers, then I could see the state of the world where they're white and see what happened to them in the 80s and 90s. And like, alternatively, with my superpowers, I go back in time, make them go the other way, and now they're colored, see what happens in 1980, 1990. And then just compare the outcomes, and that would give me the causal effect of racial classification for that person, right? We can't do that. We don't have that type of power. So, and it's actually called a fundamental problem, that nobody seems to have that power. So, what we can do, instead of trying to, that's the thought experiment, right? It's about parallel universes type of thinking. But what we can do is find people who were very similar, and the one became colored and the one became white. And then we could compare those two, even though they're both in the world that we can observe. And in fact, so this paper is really, like I said, the first point was in that class with John Donato, at least the first thinking about it. And at some point when I was in grad school, then I had an old friend and colleague who I studied with at Wits, her name was Martine Mariotti. She was working on economic history in South Africa at the time, at UCLA. And so then I contacted her and said, what do you think about this? And she thought it was cool, and then she got a sister who was in Joburg to look at what types of legal data was available. Because what we were thinking about was, if we could find the people who applied to be reclassified, and some of them were successful and some of them were not, but they were all in the pool of potential people who could have been classified again, then we could, if we could find enough of them, we could see what happened to them subsequently and use that as our estimator. I mean, it might have worked, it might not have worked, but in any case, we dropped it relatively fast, that version, because there was just not enough data, or it was too hard to get, one of the two. So then, but the idea remains, we want to find a good comparison group, right? So when we were here, now that idea fades away, and I'm here as a postdoc or maybe a senior lecturer at that time. And Miquel is my co-author, and we're good friends. And at some point we decided we need to work on something together. And we start talking to people, and this is when Catherine Kannemeyer, who gets cited in the paper, and her family, her mom in particular, she says, well, my grandmother was from a family where she got classified colored and her siblings were all white. And so you had a family, like a biological family, that got classified differently, with all the things that happened depending on how your classification went, right? So different neighborhoods they grew up in, and families got estranged. And I mean, so Catherine's mom invited us for lunch and just told us the story and showed us the family albums. It's incredible. It's just crazy what happened, for real. So like she only met Catherine's mom now, only met her grandmother once in her whole life. Even though they were all from Cape Town, and you couldn't go to that other area, which was literally across from the M3. So, you know, like we're talking of about 10 kilometers distance, with massive actual distance because of how it was. So, I mean, it was an incredibly moving story because it was real. It was not just statistics at that point. But how it helped us, going back to this paper, was we thought, well, okay, if in this case, if we could trace out her siblings and find Catherine and Catherine's cousins, that would be a form of identification, a way to understand what happened and how these classifications affected them, because they were siblings, right? And if we could find a few such families, then even if it's just in Cape Town, then we would have a really clean way to understand the effects of this law, or of that particular event, rather. And in fact, as we were reading and thinking and trying, lots of people, I mean, it's astounding how many people could tell you, in my family there was this, in my family there was this. It was really a revelation for us. But ultimately, why we didn't follow it up is, not that I think it's a bad idea, I still think it's a good idea, it's a fantastic idea. It would be very labor intensive. It would take a lot of resources, and it's probably better suited to a qualitative study than a statistical study.
But the thing about your paper that you do is you combine those two approaches in a way, in a way that's really absorbing. So you use the hard data, but that story of Catherine's is replicated in so many Cape Town families. I mean, when I did the biography on Trevor Manuel, his father's family, some of the siblings were reclassified white. And they tried to encourage one of the aunts who was light-skinned to reclassify. They said, you'll get a better pension. There you are, the income differential. And she didn't on grounds of loyalty, but as you say, it is a quintessential Cape Town phenomenon. But what you've found is that there's an objective outcome of a massive income differential that happens over, that happened in 10 years or 15 years. I wonder if you could just speak about the results you found, the income differential of, I think, 4 million or whatever it.
No, sorry, that in the paper, I mean, that's just a simulation. We just say, for example, it could be this, it could be that. What we do estimate though, is that our point estimate is 4. So meaning that the white person who's comparable earned 4 times as much as the colored person. Right? And so the way to interpret it is for that little cohort around 1951, if you got classified as white, then on average your income would have been 4 times as colored. There's some imprecision about the estimates because it's a characteristic of the methods that we use. They're quite sensitive, and so the parameters shift about quite a bit. But even the most conservative of our estimates have it at 2. So our most likely estimate, or the one that we present, is our base scenario is 4. But even if you're really skeptical, it's still more than double. Just from getting classified the other way.
It's extraordinary, and that's just on classification. You didn't even take into account the attendant effects of Group Areas Act or those kind of things, which probably also had huge economic effects.
No. I mean, so in fact, it's the other way around. Our estimate, which is very different, right? I think you asked me this already, from like other studies. Most studies on discrimination will try to really narrow down some component and then try to estimate what's happening here. So if you think of the most recent studies in economics, they're all these CV studies. And you get a CV and you have a database full of CVs, and then you randomly allocate the names or something else that signifies the race of the person to the CV. And then you send out the CVs and you send out thousands of them and you measure what's the callback rate or something like that. Right? It's a very clean identification. And in fact, that's how the literature evolved, because through the 90s and even the 2000s, there was a great pressure on identification, statistical identification. But the questions become narrower and narrower and narrower. So in the end, we can say, yes, there is discrimination in Boston and Chicago on callback rates. But like labor markets are much bigger than callback rates. Right? Like it's so small and so narrow. When this was one of our motives, that like in the apartheid case, it just wasn't interesting even to ask the questions which they moved towards, because it was much bigger. It's like you said, it's the Group Areas Act, and it was the Separate Amenities Act, and it was the fact that for a lot of people you couldn't even live in the cities. And so labor market discrimination, which is where the discipline has evolved the most, is really about, see, there's a definition, and the definition is about people who are otherwise equally productive, right? When people are being treated differently in the labor market who are otherwise equally productive because of their group membership, that's discrimination. But in the South African case, it just doesn't make sense because you had the Apartheid Education Act, right? And so that shaped which schools you could go to and how much funding the white schools got and how much funding the other schools got and what curricula was taught in the two schools. And it had explicit labor restrictions. So some jobs were just restricted for white people, and who could study at UCT and who could study at UWC and who didn't have colleges actually to go to. So a huge amount, we don't even know how much of the discrimination was happening pre-labor market. And so thinking about people who are otherwise equally productive, it's nonsensical, but it's almost, it would feel very uncomfortable for me in our context.
To what? To
For us to even pursue that form of inquiry. Because the whole point was to create productivity differentials, or at least a big part of the point. And so our study, you asked me how it's different. Our study combines, we're just asking, it would combine residential segregation and discrimination. It would combine the fact that you had different hospitals, that you had different schools, that some areas have less safe neighborhoods, that some jobs were actually explicitly restricted. Some jobs people could hold, but you could get a lower pay scale just because of your race. Public servants, for example, if white public servants for the same job had better pay. And so ours just combines all of those things in ways which we're not sure how they're actually interacting, and asks at the end of the day, what's the net effect in the labor market?
And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about how you approach the data, seeing that there are mainly, not exclusively, but mainly economists here. How did you deal with the data that you found as a result of your the 1950-1951 kind of dividing point between when people were classified racially and when there was more fluidity, as you describe it in your paper?
Okay, so this 1951 point is actually super important, right? And the reason is because, just take a chronological timeline, 1948, the National Party wins the election. In fact, they do win by the law, but they don't even have a majority. They're close to 50, but they're not at 50. But because of the way the seats in parliament goes, they get control of parliament. And then they start implementing a whole set of things, right? So you have the Immorality Act and the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Group Areas Act and the Apartheid Education Act. And all of these laws are about race. And so before you can make sense of any of these laws, you need everyone to have a race. Otherwise, these laws don't make any sense. And so the Population Registration Act of 1950 is the one which says, okay, everyone has to get a race as a state classification. And how do they do that? They use primarily, for the stock of people in 1950, they use the 1951 census, right? So if you look at the law, the 1950 Population Registration Act, it's kind of an imprecise law in a mathematical sense, because there's different criteria that can be used to classify you. And there's three of them. One is about your appearance, one is about your social recognition or social standing. If everyone accepts that you're white, then you're white. And one is about your ancestry, okay? And that law doesn't change. In fact, the three criteria are stable across time. But what did change, and it's crucial for our paper, is that as at 1950 or 1951, which becomes crucial, there's a stock of people who nobody's quite sure, right? And you can't use birth certificates because birth certificates are not standardized and are not complete as a registry. And so for the people who were already there, basically born in 1950 or earlier, it's really the two criteria that seem to matter: the appearance and the social standing, right? Post 1951, so there's the census, and the census is crucial because it's used de facto or in practice heavily for the implementation of the Population Registration Act. For the people born after 1951 and with increasing probability, there's a chance that your parents could have been classified, or even one of your parents could have been classified. And at that point, the ancestry criteria comes into play, right? So the relative weighting, the three criteria remain unchanged, but the relative importance between those three changes discretely in 1951. And so what we find, and it was our conjecture, that there would be a shift in the proportion of people that got classified as white based on when they were born around that 1951 census.
Okay. And then how did you then determine track those people who were classified white or colored in the 1951 census to determine the outcomes, the economic outcomes that are then the conclusion of your paper?
So we don't, I mean, this is the magic of it. All we see is where they are in 1980 and 1991 and 1996. All we can see is who they are at that point in time and what their race was, right? We don't know exactly what happened. We don't even know who the marginal people were who were affected by the change in the law, or not change in the law, the change in the emphasis on the different criteria. It's really hard for me to explain this one. So let's give an example, like a bit like Catherine's family story, right? If there were lots of siblings, the ones born before 1950 would have been in the census, and so they would have been in the census, and they would have had a race in the entry in the census, and that would have been the first likely official categorization of them, or used to create that, right? The ones after, if you're ambiguous, this is the thing. So if the people born before would have been classified on appearance and standing, the people classified after, if possible, would have been classified based on their parents' classifications, right? So if even one parent, if they had a mixed race couple or an ambiguous couple, if even one parent became colored, then all subsequent children after the 1951 census would have been colored. And so with the stable distribution, the relative likelihood changed for a subset of people. And that gives us this thing that we're trying to get at, is in all material ways, in all relevant ways, they're comparable, except that because of this change, this group were less likely to get classified as white than that group.
And you also explain, and maybe for those, the benefit of people who haven't read the paper yet, why you focused on classification between coloured and white in the Cape. I think the Northern Cape and the Western Cape were your two areas, but not on other, not African, and not, how did you come to that decision to do that? You explain it, just if you can explain why you chose that criteria.
Again, it was practical. We needed to have enough people who were going to be impacted by this change in the criteria, and that just meant that practically we needed a substantial number of colored people in our subset of our data that we worked with. So if you look geographically, it's just heavily concentrated in the Western Cape and Northern Cape, right? But it's a great question, because we would have liked to. In fact, I mean, that's one of the big limitations of our paper, is that we're not saying anything about the African subpopulation or race group, which is the majority of this country. The reason was that because of the way that geographic restrictions occurred, especially in the 80s and the past laws, that if we had included the 1980 people, or the people who were there, but there's no homelands, they would only have been allowed the right to be there if they already had a job. And so it would have generated a type of selection that you would find a high proportion of Africans in the Western Cape would have had a job because of the pass laws. You would have had to get a job before you could get the pass. And that would confound our estimates. Whereas colored people had restrictions like the Group Areas Act, but were never forcibly removed to reservations. And so we were still confident enough to work with that margin, but not the colored African one.
Okay, and talking about Africans in towns and pass laws brings us in a way back to Francis and his work, and that whose name bears the prize that you won the paper for. Did his thinking influence the paper in any way, and your work and your direction of work?
I mean, in indirect ways, yes, of course. So lots of people, like I say, once you acknowledge that this is a 20-year paper in the making, there are lots of people, because I've thought about this for a long time, and I've worked with different people, and I've talked. And my friend Rodney Andrews, he worked, a friend of mine in Michigan, his thesis was on discrimination and affirmative action in the US, and we talked about these things all the time. And a few other people as well. But Francis comes in, perhaps not directly, but in many ways. I guess the first is, he used to like to say facts matter, facts matter. And that's one of the reasons I stuck with this for so long, because I thought it was important. I think it's an important paper to write. The second is, he once told me the story. I like the story. So I asked him, how did you go about getting into this labor in the gold mines research? And he said, well, I was a graduate student in the UK, and then I came back to South Africa, and for me this was the obvious and most immediate issue in the society, so I wanted to work on that. But I wasn't sure where to start or how to go about it. And so at that time, there was this young, bright guy at Chicago named Gary Becker, and he was doing all sorts of things on discrimination. And so I went to Chicago, and I decided I was going to learn about discrimination. And then he said, well, but after a few weeks I realized that what they were doing was not going to help me at all. And so I came home. And it's funny, but it's also true, because if you think of how Gary Becker wrote, not how, but the book that they did publish, he published in the 70s, which is absolutely key to the economics of discrimination. It's entirely, the whole book is about interpersonal discrimination. It's about people don't like each other, or people don't want to work with each other, or customers don't want to be served by particular people. It's interpersonal discrimination. Whereas here, you're talking of institutional discrimination and legal discrimination, right? It's an act of state here. And the interpersonal stuff, it's interesting and it's potentially relevant as well, but first and foremost, this is national policy. So it's not clear at all how you're going to use the interpersonal stuff to understand the South African context. And I thought that was a really cool story, actually, because again, so in our paper, I really don't think there's a paper like this anywhere. We didn't find anything like this, because it's so different to any other discrimination paper around. And it's a bit like the Francis story. This is something I wanted to work on. I thought it's important. And what other people were doing was just not going to be useful for us. And so you had to do what made sense to you. In that sense, I thought about him often in that regard. And of course, the third one is with Martin Wittenberg. Martin made us open the PSLSD data set when we were young people long ago. Martin was much younger then. I was a bit younger. And the PSLSD, as Murray's told us many times, is a Francis project, right? And so this is 97, maybe 98, we opened with those old drives, which we had to put in multiple ones, one at a time, so that they could link up. And we did cross tabs. It was fascinating. We also did some regressions, but you just needed to do the cross tabs by race and see the employment rate differences and the wage difference or the income differences. And that was kind of mind-blowing, really mind-blowing, because even though you knew that they would be big, the magnitudes were astounding. Now we don't get shocked by it as much, not because they're not shocking, but because we've seen it so many times.
Yeah.
Right? We've become kind of desensitized, but that was the first nationally representative survey, and those magnitudes were really incredible. And so I thought that was like really interesting, and I wanted to work on this stuff.
Yeah, no, it did seem to be a kind of path-breaking moment in really quantifying, and I think Murray said it before, quantifying poverty and what apartheid, what the legacy of apartheid had left. I'm going to ask Vimal 2 more questions, and then I'm going to open to the floor. My first question is something you've told me in passing, but I think it's really interesting for the audience. The kind of foibles, what is the word? The peculiarities of race classification done by the apartheid government meant that for you, for instance, tell your own story about how Indians became a special classification only at a particular time, and how you discovered that in doing this paper.
Yeah, so this is really fascinating. I mean, it was also shocking, but just fascinating as well. So you read the Population Registration Act of 1950, right? And it has 3 groups. One is white, which are people who are white and obviously white. I think they actually say that, who are clearly white. It's a completely self-referential definition. And then there's Africans who are of an Aboriginal tribe of Africa. I think that's the phrasing they used. It's in the paper precisely. We just copied and pasted it.
Yeah,
but,
it is there.
But it's something about like ancestral roots coming to Africa. And everyone else is colored. Right? So this is the definition now. And I was reading this and I thought, so where did my grandparents fit in? And where did my parents fit in? And so I asked my mom, like, were you ever officially colored? And she's like, I don't know, but I can't really remember. She would have been a child at the time, and I don't know if she even would have had an adult ID. Because on the ID card it used to say, at some point in time it was actually say Indian, right? But she would have been too young, most likely. But certainly at some point, if that was the case, then there were only 3 groups. Then my grandparents would have been classified colored. And then there's another law, which is not about the population registration. It's not even called an amendment. It's a different law entirely in 1959, which creates out of the colored group, which is quite there's lots of subgroups of colored anyway, but takes this one group out and says, we're going to create a 4th official group called Indian. And this is now a 4th, it's its own category. So that's just fascinating, right? Like, I mean, I hadn't even thought about this acts of, you could just change people's race just like that with the passage of law. And why did they do that even? And I just don't know. Like, what was the motive to, especially this one group, to make a separate sub?
Because it didn't make sense, I guess. Otherwise, they had to try and follow some sort of logic, you know.
Yeah, but what? I still don't know what would have been the logic behind that.
Yeah.
I mean, but I learned a lot because we read several books on history. And Miquel went into the archives and read parliamentary meeting notes, and we learned a lot in this paper. I mean, the one thing that also I hadn't realized entirely, but in retrospect, you know it, but until I did it, I didn't know, is how popular the apartheid government was with white people. You know, we don't talk about this much, but that first election was very close. They were just below 50. But after that, they're not close. They're clearly and undoubtedly the legitimate government of white South Africans. This is not to say 100%, but they are the majority, and the share just goes up and up and up. Until the 80s, in the 1980s, they start losing share dramatically, but they're losing it to the Conservative Party, who by all accounts would have been even worse than the National Party. And so this is something which we don't really think about much. Actually.
But you used the phrase in your paper, it was to basically pander to a rent-seeking dominant elite. I mean, that was what the National Party did, so maybe that explains it. It was a rent-seeking attempt of a dominant group in terms of jobs, in terms of schools, in terms of all sorts of advantages.
Right. Sure.
That's what you say.
I agree with you.
Okay, here's my last question, and then we'll open it up. It's very. I don't want to fall into the temptation of saying, this is a great paper. It has huge academic worth, but what does it mean? Policy, is there a policy implication? But I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you think that there are lessons for this in terms of policy, of all sorts of ways to redress the effects of the history of racial discrimination? Do you see something coming out of it that you can argue in that respect?
Look, first and foremost, it's an economic history paper, right? It's about something that happened some time ago. And then in the paper, but it's also true in everything we teach and we do, that our contemporary South Africa is still an overwhelmingly racialized one. Whether you're thinking of poverty or education or employment or pick your social welfare outcomes, health. And so to some extent it's a really important paper because it just brings back something that everyone knows, I think, that the contemporary and the history are not separable. Yeah. I don't know if there's a direct policy relevance because that wasn't the aim of that paper. But that being said, I mean, the one thing that's striking about that number we got, the 4, is just imagine, so if you had, let's call someone John, and John could have been classified colored or could have been classified white. And white John makes, let's say, 4 times as much as colored John every year for 40 years. Right? So colored John makes, I'm just picking a number, but let's say 100,000 a year on average over his adult life. And so 40 years of work, that's 4 million rand. White John, the same person, if they got classified the other way, would have made 16 million rand. Right? So that's a phenomenal margin because you could have a higher standard of living your whole life, a much higher material standard of living. B, you already were getting massive state support because you got safer neighborhoods, you got better schools, you got better hospitals. C, you can accumulate wealth, right? So you could spend twice as much or even 3 times as much and still leave a huge bequest, a bequest equal to colored John's entire lifetime earnings to your children. You can help your children with their college, with putting down payments on houses. Like the magnitude is so insane that this was for me mind-blowing when you just started working through little type of spreadsheet calculations of what this would mean. Because, and then we get into contemporary issues like black tax, where some people have to plan to not just save and pay off debt, but also look after their elderly parents, because the parents didn't have the opportunity to accumulate wealth. And so these schisms are completely contemporary. There's no explicit policy advice, but I think that South Africa has like a collective amnesia of some sort, or the emperor's new clothes problem, where the emperor isn't wearing any clothes, but we all say it's fine, it's nice, we don't talk about it much. Because these things don't just go away because we all tacitly or explicitly agreed. They're still there and they're still bubbling below the surface, and I think it makes for an incredibly unstable society, actually, that we don't own this, that it's part of our history, and we pretend that it's not an issue now. And so I do think it's incredibly relevant now, even though it's an economic history paper, but the paper doesn't venture into any of those type of issues.
Thank you so much, Vimal. I've got a lot of other questions because there's such a wealth of information here, but I'm going to open to the floor. We have about 15 minutes, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So yes.
Professor, I have 2 friends that cross from being colored to white. Now, they came to me, they said to me one day, Gilbert, I can't see properly. I asked him why. I'm not going to mention them because of ethical. I said, why not sleeping with them? He said, I'm white and my family is colored. And I refuse to move from Crawford somewhere else and so on. And I asked him, what's the problem? He said, I've been ostracized. I said, why? You've been ostracized. Don't you have friends? Don't you have white friends? He said, no, I can't fit in there. The reason why I opted to be white is because I didn't want to lose our family home. That's number one. The other one is, his father decided he's going to be white just to attend Elsenburg school. But they were never happy, and they couldn't fit in with whites. My question is, did you meet those who crossed to be whites and not happy, or was it insignificant, those who crossed and not happy?
That's such an interesting anecdote. So we didn't do qualitative work. We didn't actually interview people. The entire paper is using just that 1951 change in the law. So people weren't being reclassified. They were being classified differently. And that's what helps us to do the econometric survey. But, I mean, what you're talking about is a little bit like the story that Catherine told us of our family and the family dynamics and the social repercussions thereof. I think that there would be such an interesting paper to actually do it systematically. But I don't know of any paper like this or any research like this.
Yes,
Hi, thank you for your paper. I know when you mentioned how the law made that discrete change, you were talking about how the proportion of races changed. So on the one hand, that could have been at population level, but my question is, did you look at that proportional change at a clustered, like stratum level, like a household level?
Well, it's a census. So what would be the stratum?
I'm not sure, but in your methods, did you just look at the change across the whole population?
So in our estimation sample, we exclude anyone who survives in the estimation sample is the areas which would now be Northern Cape and Western Cape, and race of of white or colored. And that's the estimation sample.
Okay. So then, did the proportions within the races discretely change at that point?
Yes, that's the whole magic of the paper, of the identification strategy. It drops by a small amount, between 3 and 4%, so it's a fuzzy discontinuity. It still gives us enough power to make the statement that it's clear that there's massive differentials, but that small amount is why our estimates are still relatively imprecise. Yeah.
Martin?
I mean, one of the things which is interesting about that whole episode is that, I mean, to some extent, kind of we know that race is arbitrary, there's no genetics or whatever, but that actually it kind of matters, I mean, in a big way because of the way the laws worked, so it's kind of like something that I guess economists are kind of like uncomfortable about, like in a sense, what's objective reality can actually be formed by law, kind of like in a sense, if the law treats you differently over a long enough period, it actually makes a real difference. And I mean, I think that when he thinks about policy issues, I mean, in a sense, I guess that kind of like, that obviously was a big change, but like, I mean, small matters like where you draw boundaries and how that has access to services, is an obvious one. It can actually have really big long-run effects, but it's something that we kind of are blind to, in a sense. Economists generally work with categories where we either just take them as given, it's an obvious boundaries like municipalities or homelands or whatever, they're there, kind of like when actually they're just lines on a map, but lines on a map which actually have not just short run, but actually long run implications for what happens to people on either side of that. And I think that that's kind of like, in a sense, if you're kind of looking for, that, politics actually is not a ignorable part of like what happens in the evolution of economies and or people do, kind of like, you know. I mean, it's kind of like in the US, they do understand that. They have these sort of like studies on state differences, but it's kind of like the idea that these things can have massive cumulative impact, which I don't think has been thought through in quite the way that what you're really pointing to.
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I don't even know if I said this, but the thinking about the cumulative effects of discrimination, that's something which, again, we don't think about much. Like I said, the empirical literature in the US has become narrower and narrower. The closest I've seen to cumulative effects of these things is in the public health world, where they thought, especially about low-income and African American communities in the US, where they have this thing called the weathering hypothesis, where you have just sequence after sequence of relatively harder circumstance, such that people's aging process gets accelerated at some point. But it's you can't point to here. It's this kind of slow accumulation of hardship which generates it. And it's that type of thing which it's about. I mean, economists have a blind spot to some extent by thinking about memoryless distributions, or things just are how they are, and they yeah.
Yes.
Thanks very much, Vimal and Pippa as well for a very engaging conversation. Thoroughly enjoyed this paper. I've yet to read it in depth, but I'm excited to do so. I really enjoyed hearing about the timeline on the research process from the inception of thought to publication in the journal. I enjoyed hearing about how the story of Catherine and her family somewhat informed the research design. Not the one you ultimately went with, but one nonetheless. I'd be interested if you wouldn't mind elaborating a little bit more on what made you and your co-authors draw the line, so to speak, in, okay, we're happy with our design here, we're happy with the outcomes, we're happy with our sample size, we're happy with the framing of the paper, it's time to submit it somewhere. Because I could imagine it would have been possibly tempting to consider a wider array of outcomes, some more interesting than others, but or even later periods, like what made you stop in the 90s using the censuses there and not go further on into the 2000s? So yeah.
Yeah, I think there's lots more. I mean, there's other papers that you can write, or and we thought of the question of stopping point. So it got shaped so much. Like the thing is, you can't go back in time and get more data. So you're already constrained by the data that someone else has collected and shared. I mean, I think a census, and one of the challenges is earlier censuses, you know, South Africa drew lines again and said places like the Transkei and the Ciskei are no longer part of South Africa. And so some of the earlier censuses don't even have large parts of South Africa, or what we now call South Africa, in them. They also didn't do a great job of they weren't technically complete censuses because they really didn't put as much emphasis on counting African people. It's kind of astounding actually when you think of how things actually were done. What's the right stopping point? So we got shaped a lot by the data and what we could ask about and what we could think about. More contemporary studies, I mean, it takes so long that at some point you just need to finish, and at some points you also, or at least we got just tired. So I think that's a useful sign when you're so tired that either you must, you know, just send it or else work on other things for a while. That's a useful time to think maybe I should send it.
I have a couple of questions online.
Okay, cool.
So the first question is from Ixambas here. It says, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation, and especially for your paper, which is easily one of my favorites of any paper I've ever read. First question, I couldn't agree more with the narrow scope of research on race and economics. Your paper is especially refreshing in this way, combining causal inference with a broad effect. Do you think such natural experiments exist elsewhere too, allowing others to follow in your approach? And the second one, In some sense, one could go even broader. There are effects of apartheid that your paper does not pick up, such as there's a large South African literature on white income being higher because of racial economic exploitation of others. Did you look at this, for example? Can you see a change in white incomes too? Much less well identified?
Yeah, so I mean, for Iksan especially, like the question is how are you going to identify these things, right? Like I think they're all sensible questions and interesting if you can. We thought a little bit about generalizability, so that we did think about, and it turns out that there's several countries which have some types of rules which gives a group privileged access or privileged rights. Whether it's affirmative action rules or restrictions, or there's lots of countries where certain groups have different rights. And you know, for example, caste in India, or now there's affirmative action in Brazil, or certain native population in Canada and in the US for certain things, in fact, and Malaysia. So in those cases, there is the potential. The key requirement from this approach is that you can find something which is just completely unrelated, which generates a shift in how people are getting classified, right? So one tribe can go from being an advantage to a scheduled class tribe in India. If you can find it, then you've got the preconditions for using it. Another thing we thought about was that citizenship rights. When countries make changes in their citizenship rules, or the rights that people who, you know, or you reduce the restrictions of citizenry, or of people with different levels of citizenship, or legal residence. That might be a place where it could be helpful. But it's also hard for us and for anyone, because we still had to wait 30 years for this to be even possible, because if you did it too soon after, you can look at little children, is the problem. Yeah. And so that makes it harder. I forget, what was your second question?
Let me repeat it again. In some sense, one could go even broader. There are effects of apartheid that your paper does not pick up, such as there is a large South African literature on white income being higher, inverted commas, because of racial economic exploitation of others. Did you look at this? For example, can you see a change in white incomes too?
So we can't actually, I mean, all we can do is measure the discontinuity ultimately, right? So we're looking at the average before and the average after, which is a mixture of colored and white people before and colored and white people after. And because we're willing to make the argument that the share has changed, then any corresponding share in the combined aggregate income can be attributed to that margin. And so we're not actually looking explicitly in any subgroup even. But
I think the underlying point is that, I mean, in a sense, the white being above the line, I mean, that could be due to either them getting excess rents from somewhere, or it could be that the others are getting chiseled down. But you won't be able to separate out which part is it. Is it that the one is getting shifted up, the other one getting shifted down? I mean, all you can see is the gap.
Exactly.
So,
and in all likelihood, it's both.
Both,
but
exactly.
you can't separate them out with this method. But I'm happy to chat to Iksan on it.
Okay, it's time for one last question. Murray.
So one to comment just about the inequality of opportunity literature really tries to hone in on these attributes as you talk about, and it's really founded econometrically. It's gone nowhere slowly, in my opinion, because it's so hard to actually make these causal arguments about the impact of these attributes on outcomes. So that's just like a long-winded way of congratulating you on an excellent paper, but locating it in, because you're talking about processes that generate inequality, that that are just because of these attributes. They've got nothing to do with your ability or anything. The other question, maybe you've got something to say for the young scholars here about, you mentioned that Francis told the story about Gary Becker, and you yourself were thinking, okay, but the discrimination literature just doesn't really talk to what you're trying to do here in the South African context. So how did it go with the journals? I mean, these international journals engage with their body of work, in a sense.
Yeah, so we got rejected from a number of journals. And I guess, I mean, if you just kind of prepare yourself for that, because it's quite likely, then it doesn't bother you that much. In fact, and we didn't get, so fortunately for us, I think we didn't get any nasty or dumb types of referee reports. They were all really good. Some were polite and fine, but some were fantastic. And they really, really thought hard about what we were trying to do and gave us feedback, which was really, really excellent. I thought. But eventually you do get tired of like send it and wait, and then you get this kind of feedback. Look, I mean, for me, like I said, it was such a long thing that I wasn't that attached to where it was going to go in the end. I was just happy we finished it. But like, if you are attached to publication and publication in high status journals and things like that, then yeah, it's better to think of it as a portfolio. You know, you've got a set of papers, there are a set of journals, and there's a lot of chaos also, and eventually things will work out, I guess.
Thank you very much, Vimal. I just want to say two things, and then we wrap. When Vimal was awarded the prize, and it was in the televised, the Zoomed lecture of Angus Deaton for the Francis Wilson Memorial, so it kind of went out to everybody who was online, which included Trevor Manuel, former finance minister, who called and he said, what was that paper? It was something he thought by UWC students. I said, no, it was from us. So, and Vimal kindly sent him the paper, which he used as the basis of an address to a UN audience on Mandela Day on non-racialism. And he said it was really important to understand this. I mean, his family has been through much the same process that you described with Catherine Cunninghama's family. And the second thing is, I mean, one thing to think about, it's very hard to measure, but if the government actually did its job, it would make redress a lot easier. So his cousins lost a big property and business in Andringa Street in the middle of Stellenbosch, where Pick n Pay now is, just next to the university. And they were moved to a coloured group area, and they applied and applied and applied for restitution, which they still haven't got, 35 odd years later or whenever it was. So if the government just did its job, it would help. And then one can think about the policy for further redress as well. But Vimal, your paper's fantastic. It had just had so much depth and so much texture in it, and really well researched. So congratulations to you and Miquel, and thank you very much for coming. I also just want to use the opportunity now that, seeing I've got this chair, to say farewell to Murray, and we hope he goes well. I think that we'll miss him a hell of a lot more than he'll miss us. but we wish him well, and we really will miss you a lot, Murray, and all your inputs and the richness that you bring to SALDRU, and we hope that your year in Yale goes wonderfully. Thank you all, and thanks, Vince.